This is a cute picture of us. It's way cuter on the laptop, I'm going to tell you right now. Let's just get toward a framework of Larp counseling. So, our overview. We're going to go over what Larp counseling is in a second, but the idea, the premise here is talking about developing a working framework for the activity that we're doing, which is essentially another layer in Larp safety and a service that we provide, as well as others. We're talking about psychology, a little game studies, a little bit of neuropsych. It's very the way it is. The theoretical orientation of this is very constructivist. There's a lot of existentialism, as well as there's going to be like 1 minute of Lacan. I swear to God, that's it. I'm gonna live with myself for like 1 minute, and then it'll be over. We're doing some original data collection that is ongoing, and this will not present on that. So first and foremost, the role of Larp counseling solves a great number of issues, and many dominant cultures of play remains controversial. We propose a transparent framework to regulate actions, mitigate fear, promote growth, so that the community may continue to benefit from its use. So we wrote a paper, why we should be here. This is only tangentially related. We're sorry. But this is very interesting nonetheless, and I'm sure you'll find it interesting as well. We're to break down in 3 parts: defining goals, defining the praxis, and creating boundaries. Defining goals, where we assume you don't really know what a Larp counselor is, and we'll start from there. So the SQUO, or the status quo here, like basically we want to talk about what about the status quo necessitates this change and implementation of this role. Larp is hard.
Yeah, it's exhausting. You're going to exhaust yourself.
It's kind of hard to do too, right? It's not something that people pick up very well and do. Sometimes they need guidance, and the best of us still need guidance in game from time to time. All right, Lacan. Larp is tantamount to Lacanian notion of drive in that it perpetuates a system designed to annihilate participation, and then it assumes another logic. This is a critique mostly of like the blockbuster paradigm, but essentially one is compelled to invest personal energy, like i.e. libido, based on the thanatic notion of escaping death, where they attempt to engage in cyclical ritual around an impossible goal, where they attempt to affect change and occasionally succeed, thus like adding inspiration for that libido, and complete the drive circuit, and then continue to exhaustion/termination. The blockbuster design consumes one's individualistic output and digests it within a vacuum, and then assumes the function of telling the organizer's planned story, which exists outside the realm of player output. I would take this psychologically, or as Descartes would, and I'll stand by that. Not so much like Lacanian analytics. And then there are tools that we currently use, like out-of-game sanctuary spaces, which do work, and they are we're having a lot of success with those in the field. However, they are not perfect, right? While they halt regulatory resource depleting activities and replenish them, they are inaccessible in many ways, physically and psychically, because often you don't know that you need one, or to go get it. In fact, Larp is inherently something that distracts you from those needs. If you're depleting your resources, you don't really, you are not in the perfect mindset to address those your own personal needs. This one's controversial.
Do you have to Larp much?
Yeah.
Okay. So operating from here is that there are certain people who will take on attention or ask for help in service of gaining attention for themselves outside of a system of satisfying what we might think of as like an actual dilemma or actual crisis. We start to get into how to. I'm sorry, actually, am I heard him speak?
No, that's fine. So basically, so LMS, as coined by like Lizzie Stark, was a tongue-in-cheek way of saying that that enabled her to talk about this prevalence of participants consciously or unconsciously fall victim falsely to have claimed to have been previously harmed by the LARP in some capacity or inflate their symptoms in order to gain attention / care. And that is like a thing that may or may not happen. Stark says it does. I would argue that it also does, but the difference is where Stark would say those people are like should not be given that attention. I would argue that they do, regardless of what their intent is. It's like consciously or unconsciously. And then of course there's Lori Brown's paper, who she concludes that players will always require emotional labor no matter what. That is like the status quo. That is probably now and forever. But the real question is whose responsibility is to deal with that. Is it an organizer? Is it a safety team? Is it a Larp Counselor?
Other players?
Right, and that's something that there's people implement different solutions to with really mixed results.
So we propose that the Larp Counselor is the person who would take on that emotional labor for a game. They occupy a diegetic and non-diegetic space in order to mitigate, resolve, and prevent issues on a variety of different axes. So the diegetic space means that they occupy a role within the fiction, so they have a space within the fiction in which they are collecting data on the game using their authentic capacities as a LARPer. That then informs finding solutions for people who are coming with emotional labor needs later. They're also occupying non-diegetic spaces, such as physically the sanctuary space perhaps, but also operating largely in their non-diegetic capacity in order to unite players with play that they have been separated from through distress.
So a little bit about this. This came to Brodie through New World. It came to me through Sarah and Event Horizon. And then I think at this point we've done I've done 10 blockbusters collectively in fieldwork research on this subject. And it's gaining more and more attention. I think people are becoming more and more tolerant of implementing this sort of thing. So quick, I already didn't go through all these points. There's one very specifically that I want to go to, but if you look at them defined by activity and belief, beliefs are very important to us, hence the code of ethics that we wrote, because I think like a LARP counselor TM in this case is a person with a certain belief system follows that code of conduct, which we will get to. But the important thing here is these beliefs that LARP is a psychological intervention in and of itself. So like as in a therapist implements interventions in which to cause changes in mental status, we do not do that. We believe that the LARP itself is an intervention, and we are there to help navigate that intervention. It is chaotic and mercurial and very powerful, and in many ways uncontrollable, but the intervention can be navigated in such a way that the harms can be mitigated or even beneficial if you are, if you take care of yourself, talk to your LARP counselor. And these things are about, and then LARP epistemology is the cornerstone to navigating the intervention of the LARP. And we'll just get a little bit more into that in a second.
We can look at recently Benedetto's framework of experiential risk to better understand what transformative aspects are present within the LARP and what participants are risking, and better understand that as, again, an inherently potentially transformative experience in which our role helps mitigate the undesired effects of that, or the out-of-control parts of that. Importantly also, combining that belief with proper action is the way in which we uphold this role, which we seek to define in this program.
Yeah. So defining a praxis, where we avoid the operationalization of the character, person, observer. and favor pragmatism over psychological constructs. That was supposed to be funny, y'all. Anyways, basically, we don't want to get bogged down in the conversation about like what is a character, do characters exist, what is the amalgam of character person. We are instead talking about, we're going to use a existential therapy term called the observer. It's just it's a vessel for input, essentially, and that is how we'll be characterizing a player character. So we take on several approaches, but this framework uses an existential approach, or a humanistic one, which basically focuses on, well, we'll get into it. So just as any being's ontology is fluid and unstable, so is a player character's, or the observer.
You're using an academic word I love, but I'm not sure how well it's known. Can you explain ontology real quick?
Oh God. It is. It's like basically the study of like being, right? It's of something's existence to be. So it's like my ontology. You know, you can have personal ontologies, or you can study like ontology TM, which is like existing, of being, the act of being. Is that fair?
That works for me.
Okay.
Keep it short.
Yeah, we got a lot of slides here. For negative personal experience, so we want, human beings naturally want to reify and rationalize their ontology as something that's not fluid, because fluidity in your ontology is very, very frightening. Yes, thank you. Existentialists believe that that is one of the causes of almost all personal distress. Because of that, because that is actually impossible, you can't like freeze your ontology in the fluid world. Psychological distress can be seen as the result of failing to cope with that fluidity, but feeling the need to. This is just like a 101 on existential psychology. I'm sorry, we're getting past this, but we interpret that distress via our interactions with several ecosystems. I'm so excited to present this.
Yeah. Watch out, go for it.
You ready?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. We just wanted to throw new words at you. This is the ecological systems of Larp that we've been developing. So this is based on Rothenbrenner's systems of ecology. It's a developmental model, but we've adapted it for our own uses. So if you're not familiar with Rothenbrenner's model, it essentially was, it stated that a child grows up in an environment and certain systems act upon it, ecological systems act upon it, whether that is their teacher, their mom, or like political systems, right? They all operate at different levels, and they all affect one another, creating unique systems of interaction and affection, and how they impact that child. So ultimately, this is describing layers of ecological systems of experience moment to moment, as opposed to the environmental impacts of development over a lifespan, as Rothenbrenner did. Thus, we posit that the observer is in a constant state where they're experiencing each system independently in intersection with which constructs their fluid phenomenology, as we just talked about in the previous slide.
So there's theoretical utility to this, but specifically for what we're talking about, with establishing a framework for counseling intervention, is that we can consider these the different sites of impact to consider when coming up with solutions to either do some psychoeducation about why a player is in distress, or in setting up a strategy of coping, considering how their current problem is presenting as influenced by these different systems, what they can influence, and the types of energy it would take for us in a counseling position to have influence over those.
We don't need to go into each one individually. We are short on time, but this will be available, and we're still working on developing it further. But it is based very closely on Rothenbrenner's. I would point out that the mesosystem in this context is now the interaction of the diegetic system and the microsystem. That is, your other fellow players would be a great example of the microsystem in this case.
I'm going to get a tattoo of it, so I'll be able to look at it. I'm going to let you know we're at just about 15 minutes.
Oh
However, we have this room until 3, and it is only 2:35. So I'm pretty okay if you guys you two go another 5 minutes
Is it
or
okay,
so
5
longer.
minutes? I'm so sorry.
I came here to party.
Yeah, I think we're good for at least another
Yeah.
5 minutes.
Okay. So the term navigating the intervention we brought up earlier, which is the way of saying existing in a LARP and acknowledging its power and moving throughout it. You were just talking, but this is essentially summarizing what Brodie was just saying about that, like, the purpose of those fields of ecology, in this sense, allow us to point to the ideology, the potential ideology of presenting concerns, and say, and illustrate how we might be the most useful. And in this case, we have 2 vectors that we prefer to use.
So yeah, again, that's either doing psychoeducation around distress or using helping skills, which are usually they're on the basic counseling skills. The psychoeducation part is giving some context to what's happening with the player. So using usually LARP-derived theory to help explain what sort of dysfunction that they've found themselves within, so they then have the tools to cognitively reframe the problem that they're having, in addition to maybe some actual physical skills of taking time off of the game. In other cases, that's usually though with someone, we talk about having a neuropsych component to that, and that's to say that in ways that we haven't defined, there is a cognitive toll on participation within a LARP, as we have probably all experienced. But one's ability to engage with helpful behavior for their self starts to change over their participation, and having the type of insight and awareness to combine some of that psychoed with their problem may be lost at a certain point within participation at a LARP. So we are either, again, helping talk people, contextualizing why things are happening to people, or giving them plans of action that we estimate, usually, and with their collaboration in a non-authoritative way, to cope with what's happening using our mastery to reunite them with a playful state. That could be some examples. That may be NPCing a game if they can't return as their player. That may be changing up some internal aspects of their player so they can re-engage the player. That may be connecting them with other players. That may be telling them they should probably go home and they're probably not going to have any more fun, so long as they're on the same page with that. Not sending someone home, but saying like, hey, let's be real about this. It seems like you really miss your family right now.
Yeah, so that's the epistemological approach, and then there's like the helping skills approach, and sometimes it's a combination of both. But we find that out by locating the ideology on the fields of ecology. So this is where we wrote a paper about this part of the presentation, about where we very quickly talk about all the obvious need for regulation and standardization in a medium without any at all.
Okay, so the risk in doing this is that you have a lot of vulnerability in this spot, not only in what people are presenting to you, but also in your role being reified by the structure that you're within. Your players are told that a counselor is a safe person, in the same way that all of this LARP is a suggestion to being that they will treat it as a part of that reified structure. So you have people in vulnerable states sharing vulnerable information. And then there are a multitude of things that can go wrong where that information is shared, they give bad advice, or someone may even take on, let's say someone in crisis who is beyond their ability to help and make things worse for themselves and for the person who's come seeking help.
I think it's the bottom line here is the same thing with any sort of like intervention, right? Or any like helping is that like some people can help bad, and there's impacts to that. We don't need to. I don't think you can use your imagination for the sake of time. So we wrote a code of ethics. That's what this is about. So to mitigate these harms and allow people to feel comfortable utilizing this position, we wrote a pretty complex code of ethics.
Specifically, it says what people who are doing this role should be doing in order to perform it correctly, and what they will not do in order to define a limit both from the inside and from the out. So players know the extension of their capabilities, so that, for the sake of liability and expectation.
I think the important part on this slide is that we are synthesizing ethical standards from a multitude of helping professions across many fields. The code of ethics, you will find similarities to a number of professions and meet and exceed in many cases those ethical standards.
Primarily also professional, like the ACA. professional code of ethics.
Professional
Codes of ethics.
people. Yeah. And it contains, just very briefly, it contains 4 sections: professional conduct, relationship with players and organizers, and relationship with society, and then codes concerning diegetic interactions.
The codes concerning diegetic interactions is pretty much how you continue to participate in a playful way with the game that authentically unites a counselor with the state of play to gather data and also be at recreation within it in order to help take care of them.
Good description.
Thank you. And the ways that you generate that play, that again, still authentic but not typical of the type of dramatic arc you might have as a player.
Okay, we're still in the basically this is we're still figuring this out, right? Research is ongoing, and
I wrote this.
yeah, you want to do that?
Yeah. So we are still defining these things. The first part is gaining grounds to practice it. Also synthesizing information outside of what we might consider the small canon of literature, things that are authentically helpful and have been derived in other communities, and bringing those in. The first part is again removing some of the scary parts from it, or the superficial grounds in which someone might object to the role, to lay bare some of the more authentic places where people could find contention. We're still, again, another thing also is building discourse that can be refuted, specifically putting ideas out there that other people can come along and disagree with, and through that synthesis build very more useful information, as well as developing a dialogue in tactics rather than asserting a monologue of best practice. And then building the ability to critique these ideas that we're setting out in our code of ethics and in our practice is the next step in continuing to improve player safety through this vector.